Hello, and welcome all to Movie Hunter, the show that checks down the quality of all sorts of movies. My name is Hunter, and today in the 38th episode, our target is The Santa Claus, produced by Walt Disney Pictures, Hollywood Pictures, and Outlaw Pictures, and distributed by Buena Vista Pictures Distribution. In November of 1992, it was announced that Hollywood Pictures had acquired the script for the film, and the film was initially going to be released under the Hollywood Pictures banner, but after positive test screenings with children, it was chosen to instead be put under the Walt Disney Pictures banner. Bill Murray and Chevy Chase were both offered the role of Scott Calvin, but Chase declined due to scheduling conflicts, and Murray declined, not wanting to star in another holiday-themed film, having recently done Scrooged. Tom Selleck, Robin Williams, and Tom Hanks were similarly considered for the role before landing on Tim Allen. Patricia Richardson was considered for the role of Scott's ex-wife, which is notable because Allen and Richardson were co-stars in the sitcom Home Improvement. The reindeer were used in the film came from the Toronto Zoo. The film released on November 11, 1994 and made $190.3 million on a budget of $22 million. And received generally favorable reviews. The film was directed by John Pasquin and written by Leo Benvenuti and Steve Rudnick. It was produced by Brian Riley, Jeffrey Silver, and Robert Newmeyer. The cinematography was by Walt Lloyd, edited by Larry Bach, and the music was by Michael Convertino. The cast includes Tim Allen, Eric Lloyd, Wendy Crewson, Judge Reinhold, and David Krumholtz. The film saw two sequels in 2002 and 2006, as well as a series called The Santa Clauses in 2022. The film follows a marketing director for a toy company, Scott Calvin, spending Christmas Eve with his son Charlie after his ex-wife Laura and her boyfriend Neil drop him off. Charlie begins to have questions about Santa Claus, so Laura and Neil, both having stopped belief in Santa Claus at a young age, both believe it is time for Charlie to stop believing too, though Scott feels differently, despite not believing himself. That night, Charlie and Scott awake to a noise on the roof, where they find Santa Claus. Scott startles him and he falls off the roof and dies, and eventually fades away, leaving his suit behind and a card that tells Scott to put on the Santa suit. Scott puts it on, per Charlie's request, and the two finish delivering presents to the rest of the houses and go to the North Pole. The elves there all dress Scott as the new Santa, and the head elf, Menard, explains to Scott that since he wore Santa's coat, he accepted the agreements of the Santa Claus, and has until Thanksgiving to get his orders in a fair and report back to the North Pole. Scott and Charlie fall asleep in the North Pole and wake back up home the next morning. Scott believes the whole thing to be a dream until Charlie mentions it. The following days, Charlie's stories draw concerns from Laura, Neil, and the school, so Scott asks Charlie to keep it a secret. Over the next few months, Scott begins to gain weight, eat sugary treats, and grow a big white beard. This leads Laura and Neil to believe that Scott is purposely looking like Santa to lead on Charlie, and they present the case to the court, who suspend Scott's visitation rights. On Thanksgiving, Scott sees Charlie one more time when Bernard shows up and takes them both to the North Pole. Thinking Scott has kidnapped Charlie, Laura and Neil inform the police. On Christmas Eve, Scott is arrested, but is broken out by the elves. Scott then delivers Charlie back to Laura and Neil and convinces them that he really is Santa after giving them the presents they didn't receive as children, causing them to not believe in Santa. Laura and Neil then allow Scott back his visitation rights, and he and Charlie finish delivering Christmas presents. Firstly, let's talk about what is at the forefront of the film, the unique interpretation of Santa Claus. Now, I find this to be an interesting topic because for everything that I think is a cool interpretation, there is something that doesn't make sense and or is simply strange and feels out of place. So, when talking about things in movies that don't make sense, I try to be reasonable with it. For example, if something doesn't make a whole lot of sense, a plot hole for instance, but it's confined to a singular scene and allows the film to progress into a fun direction, I'd say let it be. Would it be better if it were more tightly written? Yes, obviously, but when making fictional worlds, errors are bound to occur and sometimes must be ignored or a belief must be suspended for the sake of the story. There are a couple of things a film can do to help with this. The first is to tell an interesting story that is heavily benefited by the fictional world. Take the Muppets, for instance, who are obviously just puppets with puppeteers behind the scenes. However, by suspending our disbelief and thinking of them as real, we are oftentimes rewarded with very charming and interesting stories. Inside Out is another example of this, in which there are many plot holes that have been pointed out, but personally, I'm able to ignore because, to me, the larger story and personification of emotions is interesting and well told enough to keep me engaged and immersed. The second thing a film can do is to have the larger fictional world make sense, oftentimes with simple rules. Toy Story is a great example of this. Many plot holes could be pointed out in the iconic film, such as why Buzz freezes up when he doesn't think himself to be a toy, or various what-if scenarios about humans discovering their secret. However, and I assume many others given the franchise's popularity, are able to ignore these things because Toy Story sets very simple yet specific rules that it, for the most part, follows. So, where does the Santa Claus fit into all this? Well, like I mentioned earlier, I think that it follows some of these rules very well, others not so much. I'd quickly like to reiterate that these rules aren't set in stone, nor are they universal. They are just my personal criteria for being able to suspend my disbelief, and everyone has their own that differs with different films. Now, I do like the idea of the Santa Claus, where the role of Santa is passed down from person to person. The execution of this is a bit strange, with them choosing murder as the way Santa is passed down, or at the very least it's the way it's presented in the film, as well as the physical transformation into Santa Claus, but overall I think the idea is good enough to tell a story from. However, my main issue with this mostly comes down to the elves, who, in their introductory scenes, are shown to be completely indifferent to the previous Santa's death. I believe this to be a plot hole too large to ignore, because introduction scenes are very important, and this is how the elves' relationship with Santa is introduced to us, with complete and utter indifference, which is very counter to what the rest of the film shows and tells us. Another odd bit is the whole believing in Santa Claus thing. The belief in Santa Claus is quite a large chunk of the story, especially with how it relates to Charlie's story. What's so odd is that Santa does exist in this film, and no reason is ever presented to us as to why Scott, Neil, Laura, and seemingly every other adult in the film chooses to not believe in him. For a film that tries to fill the gaps in the Santa lore, this film utterly fails to give us a compelling reason why the adults don't believe. If Santa is giving them presents every year, then how come they think that he doesn't? A sort of explanation is given to us that Neil and Laura didn't get a specific toy one year, and that's why they stopped believing, but that's terrible logic. They got all these other gifts, probably labeled from Santa Claus, but since they didn't get one toy, they choose it easier to believe that he doesn't exist. On top of that, the way this story is told to us, you'd think it was the most traumatic thing that ever happened to them. They seem so utterly heartbroken over the fact that they didn't get one toy, and it's so strange. Then, at the end, Scott gives them those toys to prove that he is Santa, which completely works, but also begs the question of why the previous Santa didn't give them those toys. It's all very strange, and just too consistent for me to fully be able to let it go. Overall, I do think it does some things right, and it has a lot of fun, but it is far from perfect. Next, let us discuss the protagonist, Scott Calvin, and get a little more specific with the idea of Santa Claus in this universe. Scott Calvin, similar to the film itself, I find to be a very interesting and altogether strange topic to try and talk about. I previously mentioned briefly that Scott's transformation into Santa Claus is quite bizarre, and that is because I feel like he becomes an altogether different character. In the beginning, he is shown to be quite a jerk. He cares about his son, granted, but he is absolutely brutal to his ex-wife's boyfriend, Neil, for no reason. Then, after his and Charlie's trip to the North Pole, he seems confused about whether or not it was a dream, but seems to eventually come to realize that it wasn't a dream when Charlie keeps insisting that it happened. But there isn't really a scene in which this is conveyed to us. he just starts doing increasingly more Santa Claus things. Then, when he does fully become Santa, he's a completely new character, because now he, has to be Santa. And now the main conflict of the film shifts to convincing Laura and Neil that Scott is Santa. But again, this is never explicitly shown or even told to us. Overall, Scott is just an odd character because he doesn't have a character arc of any kind, because the film is just about becoming another character, through no choice or change with Scott. It's odd because it seems like the character arc will be Scott coming to believe he is Santa, or coming to believe in Santa Claus, as he states multiple times throughout the film that he doesn't believe in Santa Claus. But no, he's just a different character altogether by the end. It's all very strange. Other than that, none of the other characters left a very big impression on me. Charlie, Scott's son, is a perfectly fine character for the role in the story, but doesn't have much to do outside of that. Laura and Neil are similarly lacking in much to do outside of fulfilling their purpose in the larger narrative. Bernard, the head elf, I suppose you could also count as a main character, but he similarly doesn't do a whole lot, except for show up randomly whenever the plot needs him. Overall, the story is very focused on Scott, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but as I've discussed, it's not all that well fleshed out. I give The Santa Claus a 6 out of 10. Despite all the complaining I've done, I do still like the film. It's enjoyable and fun enough to not be a drag to go through, at least to me. But I also can't really praise it all that much, as I can't really help but think about all the things that don't work. Regardless, like I said, I still have a good time watching it, and it's a charming film to watch around Christmas time. Very interested to see how the sequels compare. One day. Welp, that's all, folks. I hope you enjoyed, and feel free to share any opinions you had on the movie. A new episode releases each week, so stay tuned to see which film I cover next. And in case I don't see you, good afternoon, good evening, and good night.